Hello and welcome to the CodCast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Matt, we're here today to talk about studies.
Yes.
Second attempts. The first was a bit waffly, and late on Thursday before the Easter weekend, we decided to can it, didn't we?
Yeah, we weren't quite in the mood, I think, at the end of a long week. Even though it was only a 4-day week.
It had been a long week. So here we are to talk about studies, and I often find we get really good feedback from the sort of more educational, but also, because it's us, a bit more open conversation around these things as well. So it's more than you're going to get from the AusIMM website. Talking about studies, talking about the industry, talking about how everything works. And we're going to do like a bit of a two-parter, I think, aren't we? So this is more of a conceptual, bit of education, bit of talking about studies, and probably less about Coda. And then next time, we're going to come back and actually bring this all back to Coda.
Yeah, with everyone, hopefully, the industry and non-industry shareholders alike on the same level. We'll sort of take what you've learned in our little TED Talk and apply it to specifically what we have been doing, what we will be doing over the course of the rest of the year, and what to expect, I guess.
Yeah, every study moves through phases. We're going to talk about that very briefly today. And in the context of that, talk about, some things you focus on more. There are certain areas of a study which are more important, less important as well as you go through them. So we're going to talk conceptually how you do them and then how this applies, and say, might even squeeze a third part out if it goes a bit longer next time as well, because nobody loves a podcast over 10 minutes, do they? Let's start with why you do studies. So we're going to talk about what they are and the different stages. And I do think people eye roll a little bit with studies. Now, we've been back on the podcast before and we've talked about just how important that is in the commercialization of a company and how often moving a project through the study stages does far more than exploration results to drive shareholder gain. But just take a step back. It's very easy to forget when you're sitting in a West Perth office and you're moving a project through studies what you're actually dealing with, because we're dealing with big projects, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, these are big and expensive. Mines are really large human endeavors that you often don't think about them in that way. But in reality, I mean, we'll be putting in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of capital to shift millions of tons of dirt every year. And not just the ore. I mean, we think about 3 million tons per annum of processing capacity, but there's a lot of waste that comes along with that. And, I think it works out something like 350 tons of ore alone gets shifted every hour. Yeah. There's hundreds of people on site. There's revenue, $10-odd billion worth of revenue over the life of a project like this. I mean,
and this is a mid-sized project. It's not a particularly large capex. It's not a particularly unusually long mine life. It's not one of those 50-year legacy projects.
No. Ours is a medium-sized project. But even so, there are so many moving parts. Everything from the stuff you normally think about, the mining and the metallurgy and all the stuff that makes announcements, to things that you don't think about, like what's your IT system looks like? How do you do your comms on site? What size camp do you need? And how are you going to get your people to and from site? All of these questions that you simply can't just, she'll be right, rock up on day one and expect it to work. Someone has to have thought of that in advance.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And again, this is for the next episode, but just how many, as you move from a scoping study into a pre-feasibility study, just how much the additional work becomes in terms of, noting who made the decision, how was it made, why was it made, what were the alternatives, and you start getting into, big project management office kind of type scenarios and schedules and all sorts of things, so the world changes as you move through studies. So let's start, we talked about, it is not just a sort of a conceptual thing, but it does start life as a concept study. Most projects in some way, shape or form start with a concept study. Now, you never see one of those because you're not allowed to publish them. And you were talking something it was an interesting point about the concept study earlier when we were prepping this.
Yeah, like a concept study, I think you pop it in the same vein, I guess, as a scoping study or PFS, but it's really not. It's more of an extension of the exploration process or maybe something you do prior to BD. It's basically making sure that you're not wasting your time and your money. So you might have put in 20 or 30 holes into a deposit, say. Yeah. And you've got a rough sense, but you maybe don't even have a resource yet. At that point, you might just throw some basic numbers at it. How much does it normally cost to mine at this depth? How much does it normally cost to process the ore? What sort of return would you expect in terms of recovery in your metallurgy? And you throw those numbers into a very basic NPV calculation with a discounted cash flow model, and you just make sure, okay, roughly order of magnitude type stuff, is this in any way viable to become a mine? It's not massively more complicated than the process you do for RPEE, which is reasonable prospect of eventual economic extraction, which is necessary under the JORC code just to get a resource out.
Yeah, so the RPE is a really interesting one because under the JORC code now to get a resource, you don't just have to prove there's some mineralization there, you have to show that it has reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction. Now, you're allowed to get away with some reasonably fanciful assumptions in that to get the RPE. You can say, well, it doesn't mean that it has to be an economic mine today, it just means that it has to have credible potential to be an economic mine in the future. And things that kill that really quickly are things like environmental considerations, location, things where the ore body is just so wildly patchy that it could never hold together as a mine, very clearly refractory metallurgy and things like that as well. So it's pretty easy to kill some projects at that stage.
And the concept study is more than RPEE, but not so much more that it's beyond the scope of most exploration companies to do in the course of maybe a week or two. You know, you might have to send out for the occasional metallurgical test or something, but generally speaking, they're pretty rough and ready. But they give you the basic understanding that, yeah, okay, I'm not wasting my time here. I've got enough confidence to start to maybe spend a little bit more money and move on to the next stage.
So a concept study is an internal document that effectively defines whether or not things are worth moving forwards. So let's talk about the next stages of study. One of the ways I like to think about a study, we had a great operations director working here, Claire, and she would always talk about what is the justification for the next hole. Now, that could be a drill hole. That could be a huge decline. And so you've always, in mining, got that in the back of your mind. Another way to put it might be that the level of study needs to be commensurate with the amount of capital to be expended to complete the next phase of the study, to get to the next stage gate, to the next no-go decision, right?
Or all the way up to FID.
All the way up to FID. Your FID and your BFS is ultimately about, it needs to be at a level of detail and quality that justifies the entire expenditure of the CapEx and finances the mine.
You're skipping right to the end. We haven't even got to scoping yet.
All right, let's talk to a scoping study. It'd be lovely if you could do that, wouldn't it? Let's talk about scoping studies. So it's the first study that goes public, generally.
Yep.
The ASX doesn't love them, but there's a whole bunch of guidance on how to put it out and what you have to put out. It's the first study that has economics. It has detailed OPEX and CapEx breakdowns and estimations. They're often done or usually done by external engineers. You should have done a pretty significant amount of metallurgical test work. Depends on the project. Some projects may need more, some may need less. I certainly think with Coda, we did significantly more met test work than one might have done with a simple West Australian gold plant, for example.
And that's just because it's one of our higher risk areas. And every project has strengths and weaknesses and lesser and greater risks. And we benefit in some ways. Location's good. We don't have any major geohazard risks. We don't have to worry about a TSF failing and flooding a village.
Yeah, that's your tailings storage facility.
Yes, sorry, too many acronyms already. But then there are challenges in other areas.
You focus in on the met. The mining's relatively simple. Open pits are beautiful. The underground should be relatively simple. So you've got a whole bunch of things that you start to focus in on. And again, a good team will understand where the risks lie. And a scoping study will have more focus in some areas than others. With a scoping study, it's plus or minus 35% usually. Top tip for shareholders, it's never minus 35%. But I will say this is the first time in my experience, for example, where the commodity pricing is actually making the upside higher. So your CapEx never goes down 35%. It can go up within that level of confidence. But we're seeing the economics increase.
Yeah, the revenue's gone up.
Hugely because of changes in commodity pricing. And that's obviously the reason for that last update as well. So you've got plus or minus 35%. One of the things I think is worth mentioning is your table of contents and work breakdown structure.
Yeah. I think if you wanted to encapsulate what a scoping study is, it's probably the first quote unquote proper study. And by proper, I guess I mean something that you say a lot. Your table of contents in your scoping study is basically the same table of contents as you're going to see in every subsequent study all the way up to FID.
Yes.
It's just the level of detail in what that contents page is linked to
Yeah.
goes up and up and up. In a scoping study, you might have an area where the risk is low.
Yeah.
There's just a paragraph that says, yeah, we've looked, other mines in the area do this, that's what we'll do, move on. By the time you get later down the line into PFS, DFS, that paragraph will have expanded out into multiple pages and associated reports and appendices. And it's but at its core, it's answering the same question as you answered in the scoping study.
So a great example of maybe a scoping study versus a PFS versus a DFS is, say in our case, your ore processing facility. So where you're going to put the central process plant. It's important in a scoping study that significant work has been done to estimate the cost, the capital cost, the operating cost of that OPF. But perhaps in terms of the location, you're not space constrained at Elizabeth Creek. There's 5 or 6 different places it can go. You've done some basic sort of Google Earth. You've said that looks about right. There's plenty of space. So again, you put a lot of time and effort into actually making sure that it all hangs together from an engineering point of view in terms of it working as an OPF or processing facility. But you haven't, for example, got the geotechnical rigs out to make sure that every possible force is accounted for within the earth, and it's got to be 9 feet to the left or the right, or, you haven't necessarily done highly detailed heritage or flora and fauna studies for that OPF, knowing full well there's 5 different places it can go. By the time you get to a DFS, that's been checked. Every last bit of that has been checked. Now we're moving on to PFS. This is a really grown-up study. This is a serious endeavor in terms of work. A well-done scoping study should give you a very, very good understanding of the project, what the options are, and really within a decent level of accuracy, what the economic returns are likely to be. But a PFS, you're going to a much greater level of detail. You're getting serious engineering firms involved. There's a reason why, the JORC code requires a PFS to declare a reserve, for example, which is a statement of what can be mined. With a concept study, it's kind of what roughly can it be. A scoping study is defining the scope, what should it be, what can it be, and then a PFS is really breaking down to what this is and what this should be when built. I think one thing for me that's really important with a PFS is it's okay to go into a PFS with open questions, flotation versus leaching, mechanical cutting versus long hole open stoping versus hybrid methods, for example. It's not okay to finish with those questions open.
Yeah, and sorting out those questions, answering those questions, going from what could it be in a scoping study to what should it be is sort of the first phase, stage 1 of a PFS. It's doing all of your trade-off studies. It's determining everything that goes from option ABC to this is the answer. But that only gets you halfway. The next step is, okay, we know what we want to do. Now we have to go from 35% accuracy down to plus or minus 25%. And at first blush, that doesn't necessarily sound like a massive change.
10-15% increase in accuracy, but it's a lot more than that.
It's huge, It makes a really big difference. Functionally, it's sort of the difference between a top-down and a bottom-up approach, if people are familiar with those. So in a scoping study, a lot of your costing, your CapEx, and even to some extent your OpEx is done by factoring other elements from other projects. Now, we don't do that work. The engineers do that, and they have a much more extensive database than you would generally have available to the public. But ultimately, a lot of what they're doing is, well, we put a very similar piece of equipment in at a comparable project 3 years ago, inflate it up, maybe do some factoring to account for scale. Maybe it's a little bit bigger, maybe it's a little bit smaller. And that gets you a plus or minus 35% estimate. At PFS, to drop that extra 10 or 15%, you don't do that sort of factoring comparable work anymore. You do a full-on bottom-up analysis. So it's not...
What do we need? What's it cost? How does it get to site? How is it powered?
How much does it cost to install? What's the amount of concrete you need?
Uptime, downtime, availability, ongoing maintenance, sustaining capital, all of those things over the life of mine. That's there's a reason why the engineering quotes within these are, plus $500,000 to well over $1 million.
Net engineering will very easily be in 7 figures once you do process, non-process, and all of the electrical and everything. Yeah, it's a big job.
Yes. So again, we started off by talking about the context of these projects, which is you're building large projects. In Coda's case, it's far from a mega project, but it's certainly a decent scale, 35,000 tons of copper per annum, $10 billion over life of mine. And as you're starting to get into PFS, you're really getting to the pointy end of serious estimation and design work. Now, at the end of a PFS, you should get a reserve.
Yep.
Should get a very detailed, very well understood single go forward case with, again, the plan that justifies not only the expenditure of the next phase of capital, why you're doing it, and then also the go forward plan about how you're going to do it.
Your forward work program.
Your forward work program, exactly.
Right. So PFS, next stage, you would think you've gone from a pre-feasibility study, you would assume the next stage would be a feasibility study, but it might not be. You might have a feasibility study, you might have a definitive feasibility study, a bankable feasibility study. End of the day, they're all kind of just different names for the same study.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the terms end up being a bit nebulous. I mean, we've said this many times on the CodCast, but in geology, the terms are locked down so much by the JORC code. But it's quite fascinating to me how little regulation there is in the area of studies. Feasibility study, you don't see many of them these days. They're generally a DFS, definitive, or a bankable, a BFS. And really, to my mind, a DFS and a BFS are kind of the same thing, but a BFS is a DFS that a bank will accept. And so that really means it's effectively at the standards defined by the banks, who have groups of independent consulting engineers who, again, are part of this. I quite like the US sort of Institute of Chartered Engineers. They talk about classes of studies. So you've got class 5 to class 1 studies, and it's much more defined in terms of the plus or minus. But for let's call it a BFS, just for ease, you're looking at plus or minus 5 to 10% generally. And again, in most areas. And I think a really well done PFS will be very clear about which areas need to be at 5%, which areas are maybe lower risk, and how you get there. I think that's something that's often missing from studies as well.
Yeah, again, we come back to the forward work plan. I mean, I think you mentioned early on that it's the most important output in many ways of any given study, and it will define what the next one looks like. And for us, that's the target, to get to that BFS forward work plan.
Yeah.
And I think what most of the time those studies will say is you need to keep doing your environmental, so that's a big part of it.
Yep.
You need to go and do all of your engineering again, but to an even greater level of detail, which generally will involve talking to the companies who are actually going to build the thing, getting those guys involved early and establishing what your actual costs are going to be, maybe even as far as signing a contract. But
yeah, everything will be based on really clear tenders, RFQs, so your request for quotation, and a significant amount of input, not only from the consulting engineering firms, but their relationships with the people who are going to be building these things.
Or your OEMs in terms of making your actual machines. They're going to do the cutting and the digging and all of that.
Yeah, I'd say it'd be fun for a part 3 is maybe coming back and looking at the different ways that you build a mine. So, all these acronyms we throw out, but EPC, PCM, all those areas as well. And I think that's something that'd be really interesting. Matt, we've talked about BFS. To my mind, the most important study is still the pre-feasibility study, the PFS. I think there are 2 reasons for that: technical and commercial. Now, technically, there are some pretty big aspects to this, aren't there?
Yeah, I think there's a quite famous graph, which maybe you can insert for people who haven't seen it, but anyone who's spent any time at all thinking about PFS scoping studies will have. It basically compares the ability to influence versus the cost to influence at various stages of a project. Yeah. So very early on, scoping study, and particularly in PFS, you can have a huge influence on the outcome of the project and the success of the project for a relatively low cost.
Yeah.
The further down the line you go, the more expensive it is to make a change. Now, if you make a mistake in PFS, if you choose the wrong processing method, let's say, odds are you're not going to get through DFS, feed, which is final engineering design, all the way to someone with a shovel going, oh, hang on, this isn't going to work. But if you do notice that mistake later in the process, it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more to fix it when you've built the entire rest of the project around that initial mistake. So finding those mistakes and making sure you don't make them early on, really critical.
Yeah, and a huge amount of those mistakes, things like geology is a big one as well. You know, to the level of confidence that you have in the ore body, and we've seen some pretty major issues in the West Australian gold industries, for example. I mean, the mining industry hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in development and actual construction. But, you know, you can have the best construction team in the world if it's based on a faulty study and poorly understood geology, you're going to still be in real strife.
You're going to struggle.
A phenomenally well understood project, well executed study, built to an average standard is still going to be it's actually going to end up as a better outcome in most cases. And again, that's another graph. I'll see if I can find that one as well. But it's effectively your ability to influence versus your cost to influence, and then the value of implementation of a great study. And so that is a major technical part of it. Now, that leads into the commercial as well. Commercialization tends to occur after a PFS. The reason, to my mind, is going back to what we were talking about before. A scoping study is based on a lot of work, a lot of independent work, but also quite a lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
And the groups that fund and construct mines tend to be quite a conservative bunch, largely because they're dealing with huge amounts of capital. So a PFS is the point where, to my mind, you're looking at a project and you say, okay, that's really real. And you can read that study, and obviously the funders and partners read the whole thing. And you can see the quality of the independent work. You can see the names attached to the study, the independent reviews, and the way that it's been done. And a well-executed PFS, and make no mistake, Coda will absolutely always strive to the best quality product out there. And a well-executed PFS is a really good document that gives people a really good understanding of the project.
Yeah.
And that's why it tends to lead to the right commercialization outcomes versus a scoping study, which is still a very good indication of the project, but leaves a number of questions unanswered.
I think a good way to encapsulate it is a quote you found when we were prepping for this episode, which basically said, and I'll paraphrase a little bit, something along the lines of, studies don't build minds, confidence builds minds.
Yeah.
And getting to that PFS level is a really big step up in confidence.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone. As always, if you got this far, much appreciated. And send questions to info@CodaMinerals or chris.stevens@CodaMinerals.com, and we'll answer them. Thanks.